Next, from the Illinois Association of School Boards annual conference, we hear lawmakers talk about education and financial issues that legislators are now working on. Among the issues is the need for pension reform, school funding, and the potential shift of pension costs for teachers to local school districts. This runs about 1 hour.
Good morning. I think this room is a little bit jinxed. We had a couple speakers that didn't show up. I had a razzle-dazzle PowerPoint that I was going to show you, and it didn't show up. So we're going to talk through this morning. You're going to have a lot of talking faces to deal with, so I hope you'll tolerate the change in format a little bit. This has been some week for education in the city of Chicago. Earlier this week, the Advance Illinois organization, along with the Civic Federation, produced the State of Education. I don't know if any of you have seen that yet, but I would encourage you to go on the Advance Illinois website and take a look. Like a lot of things, it's probably not real encouraging, but I think it's important that we look at where we are and some of the changes that we've made, what impact they're having on us. Well, besides that, there was a series in the Chicago Tribune that dealt with truancy. I know that's an issue in all of our districts, and I know some of you are regional superintendents. That's one of the main responsibilities that you have. Well, in the city of Chicago, they've used lack of funding as an excuse not to worry about whether the kids show up or not. And they had quite an expose on that over the course of the week and the impact that that's having on a lot of children. Then, of course, there's another program called Grow Your Own Teacher. A number of the reforms that we've had dealt with teacher qualifications, and there's a growing concern about the minority representation in the teaching profession. And when you look at our student population, you'll understand why. There's something like 18 to 25% of our students are African American. Another 18 to 25% are Hispanic. And yet we have about 5% minority teachers. And students like to see a mirror of their personality, of their racial experience in front of them sometime during their learning experience. So this is an area that we have been working on in Springfield, and we'll have to continue working on it because we have a long ways to go. And the Grow Your Own program is one strategy for encouraging more minorities to go into the teaching profession and to get through the teaching education program, which could be a story all in itself. Then, of course, your meeting here today is important to find out what's been going on in education, what are some of the hot trends, what are some other districts doing, and to me that was always the value of this program, was a chance to visit with colleagues in other school districts, to hear how they're solving some of the issues and perhaps some of the issues coming down the road. And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about this morning, is some of the issues that have been building up behind the dam that we've built in legislation and the impacts that you're going to feel in your school districts. Certainly, if you go back just a few years to 2009, and many of you have been on school boards longer than that, you remember the longitudinal data system was a big impetus here in the state, where we decided finally that we need to start collecting data on our students. And the plan is that we'll start collecting that data from early childhood, preschool, all the way through college, and be able to use that data to evaluate a lot of our systems. Are we teaching the right things? Do we have the right teachers and leaders in our school buildings? So that is one of the efforts that's just in the infant stages yet of being collected. The plans and the responsibilities are now more clear, and we'll start collecting that data in the systems in a coordinated effort through early childhood, as I said, all the way through higher ed, and also in workforce placement. So the Department of Commerce and Economic Outlook have been a part of those discussions as well. Many of you have been dealing with Common Core standards. That bill was passed, or the decision to adopt those standards was made again in 2009. And we're feeling the effect of the Common Core as teachers in our school systems, our principals, our superintendents are having to incorporate that within the teaching standards that they have. We're finding out also the evaluation system for the 2 Common Core subject areas that we have. And those evaluation systems are going to be rolled out here in the next year as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about the impact for each of our districts in a moment. Teacher principal assessment was another big reform impetus in 2010. And of course, that assessment is one that's being implemented. Chicago this year, the rest of the state by 2017. So we'll see that student growth is going to be a major component of that evaluation. Much more objective standards than many have used in the past. Principal preparedness was a bill that we passed in 2010. And all of our teaching institutions are changing their method of preparing principals for our schools. And all of those teaching institutions, some 55 of them, are having to reapply to the state board for certification to see if their plans are consistent with the vision that we passed in that legislation. Performance-based college funding was passed in 2011. You may say, since your focus is on elementary and secondary education, that really doesn't concern you. Well, I think that's just the vanguard of accountability that you'll be feeling in the years ahead. What we tried to do in that process, similar to what a number of states have been doing for the last decade, was to look at the outcomes that we want from our higher education institutions and then start putting some money behind it. A number of states have put forth new money to reward institutions for doing the right thing, helping students progress, helping students graduate, look at the minority population, first-generation students, low-income students, and make sure everyone is moving towards the vision, the goal that they have, whether it's a 2-year institution, whether it's a 4-year institution. Well, that accountability is going to be trickling down into secondary education. Because what we quickly found was that students weren't prepared. And they weren't, some 60-70% of them weren't prepared. So the last year or so has been a real eye-opener for a lot of community colleges and 4-year institutions in assessing why that is and what they can do about it. There's an organization called Complete College America that also has been meeting and sharing information about best practices. And one of the best practices they found is that the answer we had for students that weren't prepared for higher education was to have developmental or remedial classes. Well, of those that enter remedial classes, only about a third of them will complete those remedial classes, and less than 20% will ever graduate in either 3 or 6 years, depending on whether they're going for a community college or a 4-year degree. So the remedial classes that we have aren't working, and they're discouraging students, and they're adding to the cost of higher education for that family. So that's an area that we're also looking at. And again, that preparedness for college and career success are what's going to trickle down into elementary, secondary. And people are going to be asking hard questions, which goes along with this report card. If only a third of the third grade students are able to read, and a third of the 8th grade students are able to do math at the grade level, something's wrong. When you look at something short of 60% of the students that graduate, and in the city of Chicago, they'd be happy with 60% graduating. We've got some serious issues that we have to look at and we have to solve together. Finally, the bill that I would just lift up as part of the reform packages that we've had in Springfield is the teacher tenure reform of 2011. Again, this is a bill that's being rolled out that we're understanding that your school boards are going to be empowered to implement and to really look at teachers and leaders as to their ability at student success, as well as achieving the kind of teaching and instruction and leadership we want in our school districts. So these are some of the reforms that have happened, and they're now being rolled out and implemented. And you're going to be feeling the impact of that in years to come. But the issues facing the district that I also would like to raise up for you are certainly the issues that you're well aware of. The issues of managed reduced appropriations from the state legislature. These are an issue that you didn't necessarily have any role in, but it's an issue of the penalty, if you will, for past spending in our state, where unlike school districts and local units of government, the state of Illinois has spent well beyond its revenue stream. And we've had all kinds of creative accounting to deal with that imbalance for well over a decade. And that creative accounting has only made the situation worse, where now we've got $8 billion of unpaid bills. We've got huge debt that exceeds our annual revenue, and we're finding the impact that's ratcheting down into school districts without having enough money to make full appropriations, and those appropriations are even reduced. This year's education budget was reduced some $200 million. And if you go over the last few years, that's millions more. As your costs have been going up, your reimbursements have been going down. So that's a vice that you've already felt. But the unfortunate news is it's not going to end anytime soon, because the financial situation that we have is dire. And unless we have some major reforms, education funding is going to continue to be pushed off the table. That's why it's important that we have some important reforms in our pension system and some of the other spending programs like the Medicaid reform that we had this year. You know, we took $2.7 billion out of the Medicaid payments that we've been making, and that's to start. We've got to make even more, or the growth in health care and the growth in eligibility for health care programs is going to continue to eat up more and more of our budget, again, leaving less and less for education. I think as you're looking at your pension issues, and there are plenty of sessions dealing with the pension topic, but as I look at the solutions that we're probably going to be voting on in the next month, I think we'll be voting on something in the lame duck session before the 98th General Assembly takes office. I think that's going to include what the Speaker, the President of the Senate, and the Governor have all favored, and that's a cost shift of the annual payment of pensions to local districts, to colleges and to universities. So that's going to be a part, as I see the crystal ball, of the financial issues you're going to have to manage. May not be something that happens tomorrow. I think most people are reasonable to know that they can't promote that in 1 year. It's going to have to be phased in. But as we have those discussions, you need to know that there's a number of us that are saying school districts need to be given a little bit of slack as well. If we're not paying the full 100% of what's appropriated for your operations, we're only paying about 2/3 of what's appropriated for your transportation, and we don't give you any relief in special education funding, we need to do something in Springfield to give you a little bit of slack as you're dealing with increased costs and less revenue. Not only less revenue from the state, but also less revenue from your property tax collections. I think another one of the financial issues you're going to be facing is the assessment issue. As we look at Common Core and the way that Common Core tests are going to be implemented, we see that most of that is going to be electronic. So the question is, do you even have internet capabilities in your school? Do you have the computers for each student to take those tests? Do your teachers and leaders know how to administer those types of computer tests? So these are all issues we're going to have to deal with in the next year, next 2 years, that are going to impact you financially as well as in your preparation. And finally, preparing students for college and career ready will have a financial impact. As I said, with higher education, there's a growing pressure that we hold you, just like we're holding higher education institutions, accountable for the resources that we give you. Now, whether that's state dollars or whether that's property tax dollars, there's still an accountability to the taxpayer for the revenue that you get and what you do with that revenue. So I think as we move forward, we need to continue the dialogue, the discussion between what you're hearing are best practices, how you see some of these ideas and how they would be implemented, and the challenges that that presents, so that we can move forward with a workable system. Because all of this is critical if we're going to have a workforce that can compete in the next decade or two. President Obama came out and reinforced what this Complete College America group has been saying, is that the U.S. needs to have more of its citizens with training beyond high school. Whether that's a year certificate, whether that's an associate degree, whether that's a 4-year BS degree or more. Our workforce needs to be better trained to be competitive globally. And that starts with you. Whether the students are prepared when they graduate from high school, whether they have the desire to move on. That's all part of the counseling and the preparation that our elementary, secondary schools can give. And we've got to push that even more. Well, these are some of the financial issues that I see us having to deal with, the challenges that you're going to have. And some of this is mandated, but some of it is kind of the fallout of some of the policies that we've adopted. And I think similar to No Child Left Behind, when that was imposed, and you fast forward 15 years or so, I don't think that the authors of that ever envisioned that we would be in the mess we're in today because of that preparing for the test system. Well, likewise, I'm sure that some of the bills and reforms that I've talked about are going to have further ramifications. We just need to keep the dialogue open and make sure that we're communicating about some of these issues. So I would just close by saying, I hope you'll stay in touch with your legislators, senators, your representatives. I hope you'll be engaged with your organization, whether it's the school board, the business officials, the administrative staff. Your organizations are very prevalent in Springfield. They need to know your views on these issues, and as we negotiate some of these issues, where you feel we can negotiate. Because if we don't work together, we're not going to solve these issues. So I thank you, and I would welcome your questions when we get to that point.
Well, thank you and good morning. Representative Pritchard, now that you've depressed these people, we're sitting there trying to think of something good that you would bring you back up a little bit before I depress you again. As I look around, there are no Democratic legislators here, so let me, to rebut this, if we were in charge, you'd have more money than you can use. I can tell you that. Look at them, they're excited.
Let's have the election again.
Speaking to a group of certainly school board members and administrators and business people of schools, I always go back to an experience I had as a teacher. I taught for a long, long time, 33 years, and I negotiated some of the contracts with the school board. A couple members, as you know, will come in, teachers come in and talk to the school board. And I always go back to a teacher that I had as a teacher. And every school board member had this lady as a teacher. And she was extremely respected and a real disciplinarian. Then I taught with her for quite a few years. So this lady and myself go in to talk to the school board. And the school board president started out with, on a bad note. I mean, don't come in here thinking you're going to get a whole lot and here's what we're going to do and all that sort of stuff. And she was sitting right next to him. And this lady put her hand on his shoulder and she said, "Now, John, "You don't mean that, do you?" He never spoke another word. It is amazing what we all have had those kind of teachers, I think, who we just admire that much that that would be the case. You know, all of us come to the legislature with different backgrounds, and that's good. There are so many issues that we obviously need to know a little bit about, but are a long way from experts on. But there's one issue that most legislators do believe they are an expert in, and that is education. And you see a lot of bills come before you. We see a lot of bills in the Education Committee that I spend most of my time. How successful have I been this session or last session? A lot of times I determine it by how many bills I was able to kill that I think are better for education. And again, I think these people who introduce those bills they're well meant. They're trying to do a good job. They're not trying to do anything bad. But the mandates that we put on schools is just almost, you can't get it done. You simply can't get it done. You simply don't have the time. And a lot of them, I think, unless they've been there, really don't fully understand that. And they mean well. They want to fix it. But it just simply doesn't work that way. You need obviously two things, I think, for good education, and one of them we really have to, and we can do something about over a period of time. I've always said from the time I started teaching until I finished teaching that if you had two elements, you were going to have good education almost every time, no matter what rules Springfield made or what the administrators did. If you have really good teachers and you have really good parents, you will have education every time. And so we have to continually work, I think, to improve those teachers' skills. Now, if you have something, let me know before you leave on how we can fix parents. We will get that. We'll get that done. I'll introduce the legislation to do that. As I said, many of you or most of you are somehow in school management business, and I think there is that feeling out there that education is broken. It's my experience that education, a lot of education is not broken. There's a lot of good things happening in education, and we're where it's broken is a situation where homes are broken, and a great number of homes are broken, and that makes it, you send a kid to class who has no respect for authority, no discipline, no desire to learn, and many times no breakfast. It is really difficult, even with good teachers, to really get the job done. Now, that doesn't mean, this is what we have. Can't get around that. So we have to do the best obvious job we can. And many times from Springfield, we attempt to try to help you with that. Sometimes, as Representative Pritchard said, it has unintended consequences. And we end up making the job tougher. But as a group, I would like to say to you, I would be willing to bet you that most people in this room really believe that there's a lot of good stuff happening at the school that you are involved with. And so we can't say it's all broken, but we do have to really work at those parts that we think we can help. Now, for instance, good teachers. How do you handle that? I've had people ask me this: are teachers better today? When you quit teaching, were teachers better when you started 30-some years ago? I think that there were good teachers then, they're good teachers now. You find, and I often say, I hope this doesn't upset any of you, but I've often said, if you want to go and find out who the good teachers are in that school, and all of us have seen those teachers, go ask the janitors. They kind of know who's making things happen, and I don't mean they're the only people who know, but if you see it, and it takes someone who is willing to come early, willing to leave late, and who really likes their job and doesn't hate Mondays. You know, I've been in school teachers' lounges, and that teacher who came in on Monday and said, "I can't wait for Friday," I guarantee is probably not going to do a good job. And we have to try to find more of those people who are self-motivated and who will obviously do a good job and have a lot of pride about it. Now, obviously, the two issues that concern most people, you talk about what's going to happen in Springfield this year. Well, only one man knows what's going to happen in Springfield, and I don't even have to tell you who that is. But obviously, the two, and it's not Representative Pritchard, okay? And it's not me, I can tell you that. But the two issues, obviously, that will dominate this year in Springfield are certainly the budget and the pension. And the pension is so entwined with the budget that this will be extremely difficult. You know, we have put ourselves in this position. All states are in trouble. There's no question. But very few are in trouble like Illinois is in trouble. And over the last 10 years in particular, with our budget, now the pension, that's been a problem for a long time, but with our budget over the last 10 years, you know, you can't steal from the pension fund, steal from the road fund, steal from other special funds, move the payment cycle back, or borrow some more money. You can only balance a budget so long like that, and finally it comes home to roost, and now we're there. And you've been told by other sessions, I'm sure, that you've been in, that things are bad. And I don't know whether Representative Pritchard would agree with this, but I think it's worse than that. I think it's worse than you know. That's how bad it is. It's one where you worry whether you can get it back over a long period of time. Government usually likes to handle a crisis and then go back to do what it did before. This is one that will take a lot of years to do. This is one where you will have to hold the line for a long time in order to solve this problem. Will government do that? I worry about whether it will do that, because we have legislators who truly believe we'll spend more, and they're not concerned about how you pay for it. And you know, none of us want to cut. None of us want to cut it, in particular in education. But unless you do, there may be bankruptcy. And none of us can afford to let that happen. So those issues, again, the budget is a huge issue, and of course the pensions are even a bigger issue and are certainly entwined with the budget itself. You know, I would guess, and as Representative Pritchard said, you know, we can only look in our crystal ball and say, here's what might happen. As you know, there are 5 different pension systems. You can't handle all of them the same way. The two that I think certainly the Speaker and the President of the Senate and the Governor would like to, it seems, agree on the pensions with regard to teachers and with regard to universities. They would probably like to pass a lot of that on to the locals. You know, I can't vote for that, and I really suspect in the end that will happen. It will be passed on, or a lot of it will be passed on to the locals for both universities. Now, I guess I was a little bit disappointed when the universities, I think, sort of agreed to that. They could handle that they would deal with that. But on the local, you know, I guess I'd ask you, how many referendums do you think would pass in your district if it were to pay for teachers' pensions? I really don't think any of them would. Many people think teachers make too much already, and that's just a fact that you can't get around. So that issue, I do believe, will be dealt with in this session of the legislature. I guess I would ask you, you know, see, I think we have a constitutional problem with it, and a lot of people agree with that. What happens if a bill is passed, it goes to the Supreme Court and strike it down? Where do we go from that point? Because all groups sort of agree that if something isn't done, it simply goes bankrupt finally. And that, I think, is really an issue that kind of scares me. It scares me a lot, to be real honest with you. Again, I hope that the best part of this particular session are actually the questions. I'm sure some of you have questions. I think we'll all try to do the best job we can to answer those questions. But again, I don't want to take too much time. Been good talking to you, and let's hopefully come up with some good questions. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me thank all of you for coming. This is a full house, and that means that these are important issues to you, and they should be, because these discussions about what will happen in Springfield, what will come down, and what has to be dealt with at the local level are going to be really near and dear to every one of you. Not only in just your policy and relational elements within the school district, but also in how you can handle even funding what you currently do, or what you are going to be left to be able to fund. After cuts and various kinds of things are on the table. So you're in the right place, and you're doing a great job in having concern over this. I also want to thank my colleagues here, Representative Pritchard and Senator Lechtenfeld. These are guys that we rely on to have good thinking on educational issues in Springfield. Both of them have really stood pretty firm for supporting those things that are good. Bob has done a great job with the Education Caucus, one of the founding members of that, and continually draws legislators together to talk about key education issues. And of course, David has had a long-running history of being an educator. So it's great to be able to turn to somebody who understands how the day-to-day things work in schools, and be able to understand and also communicate how issues will impact the local level. So thank both of them for their ongoing support of education. How many of you were in the general session and heard Diane Ravitch this morning? Okay. So we have in Illinois all this movement, and Bob did a nice job of kind of laying out all the things that we're doing in reform. You know, the longitudinal data testing, the Common Core standards, performance evaluation, ratings of teachers, eventually merit compensation, and so forth. Those are all on our table. And of course, Diane said those are not the things that really make a difference when it comes to really building a quality education system. So I see that we have some dichotomies emerging in Illinois that are going to be important for us to dialogue about over the next year and maybe decade, because we're going to have some push and pull in those regard. And then from what I read as I deal with school district leaders throughout the state, is there is a weariness that is coming in that is the worst that I've seen in my theory of education on all the various things that have to be done. The new issues related to evaluation, and the fear, really, too, of that being done well or being done in a way that's going to have an impact. I think, again, these strikes that we're seeing throughout the state are not really about dollars and cents. It's about putting a stake in the ground on what's going to happen to us as teachers. And I think I'm not saying I'm one of them, but you know, they're saying that. There's an awful lot on the table right now that is an unknown, and a fear factor is emerging, I think, in local politics and your local collective bargaining realms, that it's going to get greater and more heated and more tense as things go forward. So I don't think that we're really having solutions right now. I think what we're doing is we're creating a lot of heat. And when you get a lot of heat, you get a lot of emotion, you get a lot of anger, and you get a lot of strikes. And those things are probably going to continue until we find a new normal of some type to settle into. There are a couple things that I just wanted to say also about issues that are sort of big and broad. And one of those has to do with our tax system in Illinois. I appeared before the House Appropriations Committee last year, and I said, I'm going to say the same thing that I said to you 9 years ago, because things have not really changed. We still have a structural deficit in Illinois. We have an untenable situation that's going to emerge where the current temporary tax rate increase planning to go away, and we still haven't figured out a way to get anywhere close to being in balance. And of course, the pension issue is right there emerging at an accelerating rate in terms of requirements for state budget appropriation. So we're still wrestling over the idea, are we actually going to get a system that can be in balance at any point in time, or are we just going to continue to manage these delay in payments, no resources, prorations of GSA, prorations of other kind of categorical funds, and so forth. And my sense is that if history is a good teacher, we're not going to have a solution on that in the future either. And I think the temporary elements of the current tax increase are going to be questioned as to whether or not they can even possibly go away. The other thing I think that will emerge is concepts about doing some sort of a progressive tax structure in Illinois. And of course, our Constitution doesn't provide for that. But watch for dialogue on that. I think that will be a discussion point coming forward here in the next several years. And of course, with one party now in complete control of everything, we'll depend on Bob and Dave to be good voices on some of these issues. But we don't know. They're not at the table here today to tell us what's on their agenda. And sometimes it's hard for us to be able to identify those things. One of the issues around that whole progressive tax concept is maybe you don't have to do a constitutional amendment. Maybe you can get at that by doing some sort of tax credits for the poor or for those who make less, and graduate that and essentially create a progressive system without having a progressive tax structure. Now that's a big, tall order to communicate to people how it works. But the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability has been talking about that for the last decade. And I think it's probably going to be time for their voice to be heard a little bit, simply because we still do not have a tax system in Illinois that can support its current public programs. And so we're going to have to deal with that somehow. Another issue I think you should be aware about before I talk about some pension issues is the State Board of Education is taking a look at general state aid formula. And part of their agenda this year is to look at, should there be some changes made to that formula. For instance, elimination of the flat grant, or maybe not prorating the foundation level of 6119, leaving 119 as the foundation level and doing a proration, but maybe moving it down to the 5730, which it really is. Those are going to be key questions that the State Board of Education will be talking about in their budget discussions between now and January. So that's in advance of the legislative session, but those issues will get communicated to the legislature as part of the State Board of Education's legislative agenda. And we need to watch for that as well. We've had some discussions with our Illinois Education Roundtable, which represents 18 associations, not just the 3 that co-sponsor this conference. And we're starting to talk about the need to have a greater, more broad dialogue about public funding for schools rather than continuing in Band-Aid approaches to changing the formulas. The formula right now has a lot of Band-Aids attached to it. One of those biggest ones is the double whammy formula that compensates for the impact of the tax cap that came in the 90s. And that's costing us about $650 million, a big price tag. But it's a Band-Aid, because of how that law was written in 1991 and 94, I guess. So as we have these dialogues, we need to figure out, is there a way for us to fix just that formula, let alone the overall funding scheme throughout the state of Illinois. So we're likely to call for some sort of a funding summit coming up here and actually ask the State Board of Education not to put forward too much in terms of change until we can have a broader dialogue. We need to kind of revisit the whole issue of adequacy and equity as concepts. That's what the state funding system for education is supposed to do, is get at those kinds of issues. And we have probably the largest disparity in funding of any state in the nation in Illinois. And that question needs to be on the table. We need to dialogue about that before you start fixing and doing Band-Aid approaches to formulas. On the pension front, we've advocated all through the last several years as the pension crisis emerging that we really don't have a pension problem, we have a funding problem. In fact, if you were to look at the actual percent that any sort of benefit increases have on the current unfunded liability, it's less than 10% of that unfunded liability that's tied to actual benefits. Now, there are some impacts that are tied to actuarial assumptions that have changed, people living longer, and maybe people making salaries that are a little bit higher than what was anticipated at the beginning. But even that's only 7% of the total unfunded liability. So you can see the rest of the whole problem is the big part of the problem. And those are the things that we really aren't talking so much about. How can the state guarantee, if they make changes on the benefit side, how can they guarantee that they really will reform the problem? And I've always said that when you reform something, you need to change it so it works better. And I don't think we really have an issue with the benefit side. I think we have an issue with the funding side. So that's where we need to focus our efforts on reform. The current bills that are being kicked around all approach the pension system a little bit differently. The leading bill likely to get some play in that lame duck session will be what came out of Madigan's office, and it was actually part of the dialogue that the Alliance, Brent Clark and myself and Ben Schwarm for the School Board Association had with the Speaker and the Senate President this last year. And we really talked through pretty much every possible issue. We issued a little white paper out of Illinois ASBO just a couple months ago that summarized a lot of those things. We know that there is a definite push, and I would say you should bet on it if you're a bettor. You should bet on a normal cost being pushed down. I mean, I don't see any relenting on that as a common goal, and that's coming from the one man who does typically set the table in terms of what's going to happen in regard to these reform issues. So I would bet on that. And then you're probably talking about a long period of time. The current bill had a 0.6% that would come down each year over the first 10, and then 0.5 thereafter until we get the whole thing down on the schools. And in terms of the value of that, last year the value of the normal cost was about a little over 8% in terms of your TRS salaries. After you take out some of the federal pieces and all of that kind of thing, it was about a 7.65% normal cost. So that's where you can kind of go from. And if you think about it at 0.6% over time, it's going to take quite a while to get all the way up to somewhere around that 8%. So you may be looking at a 10, 12-year phase-in. But still, what I'm hearing with no increases in the AV, and in fact decreases in many areas, proration on general state aid, proration on transportation, taking another 0.6% impact per year is going to be difficult. We raised that issue, and we said, where are we going to get this money, given the rest of the condition in here in terms of school funding? And the answer given to us by the two legislative leaders was pretty clear. Get it from your teachers. This is going to need hardball collective bargaining for you to work that into your contracts. That's where you can get it. Which, in some respects, tells us a couple things. One, there is no love lost with teachers and the legislative leadership right now. And that points to some bigger policy issues having to do with fallout. 2 elections ago, the IEA didn't spend its money on Madigan's campaign caucus and pushed most of that to the governor's race, and that caused some issues that have never been sort of resolved. So right now there isn't really a concern about what the impact might be on teachers if you went in and did some hardline bargaining and tried to incorporate those costs into your contracts. I mentioned in that meeting that we already have had several years of hard freezes across our districts, soft freezes, step only, no increase in the base salary. Now this year we're seeing a lot of different strikes emerging or threats of strike, and typically those hard freeze dialogues are built into a lot of that issue. So the idea of going and getting it from your teachers is going to be a pretty hard thing for you to do. But just know that's the mindset. The mindset is you have a source that you can go get, and that is in teacher salary increases. And by the way, if you suppress those, it will diminish the unfunded liability and also the future liability, and that normal cost is connected to that. So, just kind of have an understanding of that particular issue. Now, we did say if the normal cost has to go down to districts, and that's what you're really set on, then here are some things that we think are really important. One, it has to be phased in as little as possible or as long as possible, because you can't take huge impacts right now on your budgets. It's just really impossible. And secondly, try to give us something back. Give us some freedom in other mandate areas where we can have a little bit more control over how we deal with costs. And one of those areas that we've advocated, and we've actually advocated this with several different groups, is that the Illinois regulations for special education, class size, and so forth, they exceed the federal requirements. I don't believe in the funding scenario we're in that we can exceed any requirements just because we want to. We have to be able to have those resources and make decisions. Not to say that we wouldn't make really good decisions about how to serve those students, but we can't be forced into higher standards and have no control over being able to use those dollars. Also, large cost mandates, like for instance the PE mandate. And people will say, well, we have obese children. Well, Illinois is only one of 2 states that has a mandate in PE like we have. And you know what? Our students are just as obese as every other state's students. So it's not the PE mandate that's causing any sort of great health and benefit for our students. And yet, it is required that every student have PE every day in Illinois. And that's, again, above what national standards are in other states, and maybe we need to get some relief in that area. These are direct costs to our budget that are significant, and maybe could provide some relief. Other areas, we asked for some consideration of just the current mechanics of things. For instance, many of you with declining EAV are seeing increasing tax rates, because the CPI is pushing that aggregate limit up. But you are now beginning to see many districts hitting the top in a particular fund. So the statute has a limit on the education fund, a limit on the O&M fund, limit on transportation. So as you start hitting those limits, you still may have aggregate access available under the cap, but you can't access it in the funds that you need. So we asked for some freedom in that particular area. Also, we've been having this, ongoing every 3-year proposal to extend freedom to do interfund transfers between the operating funds. But it's never been permanent. It's always temporary. It just gets extended 3 more years. Well, that's going to be up and due here coming up. And we say, we're on our 3rd round. Perhaps let's just make this permanent. Let's just give more flexibility to districts to be able to put their money in the right places. When you had transportation cuts, many districts had to begin taking education fund resources to cover that gap, because you still had to transport students. So flexibility, isn't there until you get to the end of the year where you do a transfer. And that's not very transparent, I don't think, in terms of budgeting and everything else. And we want some of those kinds of issues to be resolved. So we asked for those kinds of things to be considered as maybe some responses. If you're going to give us a normal cost, give us some other flexibilities and some things that we can do to kind of reduce our costs in other areas. The only person who picked that up in a pension proposal was Kyle McCarter. It's not in the Madigan proposal, and even though we had a long dialogue about the possibility of that, I even wrote language and gave it to them that they could use. None of that made it to the table at the very end. The more important focus, I think, from the leaders was twofold. One, how can we push the normal costs on the school districts? And secondly, how can we fix Tier 2? And Tier 2 does need to be fixed. We're charging people almost 4.5% more than it really costs to deliver those benefits. And at some point in time, there's going to be a lawsuit regarding that. And those Tier 2 resources can't be underwriting Tier 1 benefits. That just won't work. So we need reform. It's going to happen in one way or another. and we'll be watching for it. So those are some of the things that we're talking about, and we're hoping we can have some influence on as an association and as an alliance. And I know my partners at the school board and the Superintendent's Association are standing with me on that, and we do an awful lot of good work together on your behalf, and we'll be happy to answer any of your questions.
I've been involved in education for 37 years, and it's disappointing to me that we keep coming and we allow you, the legislators, to define education without ever changing your language. You have demagogued the other party. You have demagogued whether or not teachers should be evaluated, whether or not we've got tenure is the wrong instrument. It has to start at the top. You have to be proud of education.
Is there a question here someplace that we can have these people
My
answer?
question is, why can't you have the discipline to put your differences aside ideologically and come up with solutions? This whole conference is about solutions and discipline, but it's got to start with you. And what are you going to do to change the climate, to change the dialogue, and to make education interactive?
You just heard the statement on Senate Bill 7 was unanimous. I define that as being bipartisan. The Legislative Education Caucus that we formed was bicameral and bipartisan. There are a great number of us in Springfield that are trying to work together. So don't start saying this is a political issue. We're talking about the process, how we implement some of these principles. So those disagreements may seem to be partisan, but again, they come down to the core principles of what we're trying to do. At the end of the day, you have to look at the outcome. And if you don't like the outcome, you got to change something, and that's what we're doing in Springfield. If we're not doing the right thing, then what are you doing in the districts? You know, we've got to assume ownership for this. And I agree, Springfield does not have the answer. You perhaps have all the answers. And that's why I say you've got to share that with the legislators who are making the rules. And we've got to defeat some of these rules that are being proposed. But at the end of the day, you've got to look at, are our students being prepared for life? And right now, the evidence does not suggest that. Yes, in some places, we've got wonderful systems with wonderful districts, with kids learning well beyond expectations. But again, we look at the averages, and the averages are disappointing.
But averages are standardized tests. And yet we just came from a wonderful speaker who said that test scores are up, graduation rates are up, but we're still demagoguing education, we're still demagoguing teachers. When are we as a society going to take ownership? And it starts with you guys. We just came out of an election cycle that was so negative that you have to be the leaders. That's what we're asking you to do. We don't have the purse strings. You do.
Let me just make a comment. In defense of my friends here, they're taking this blow as if they are the legislature. These are two men. And these are two really good men who do good work and do collaborate and do draw people together and talk about things. So I just want to make sure that we don't let it get to be to the point where we're attacking them, but rather trying to work with them. And secondly, let me say that there are many voices involved in school policy dialogue. And a lot of those are not educators. A lot of those are reform entities that bring a lot of money to the table and try to push various kinds of reforms down into education. A lot of it comes from the business community. Okay, it always amazes me. There's so many people that are interested in how we run schools, and they're not educators. But we do try, and that's one of the reasons why we have groups like the Illinois Education Roundtable and Education Caucus, to have these kind of dialogues really about education between educators, between legislators, between leaders at the local level, like yourselves. You know, in all of your divisional meetings and regional meetings, these issues are dialogued about, and that is where we are going to get the strength, I think, to stand and say, here's what's good for education, here's what doesn't work, here's what we're going to resist. Some of the big money entities are trying to push reforms down on us, and we're going to say, wait a minute, wait a minute. That isn't the truth. Here's the truth. We know it, we live it, we breathe it every day in schools. We know what works and we know what doesn't, and we're going to stand for that. But you got to remember, you are facing a wave of national pressure, a wave of reform pressure from people who are above and beyond my pay grade. And they're pushing a lot of resources into this demagoguery of public schools. And I'll just comment a little bit on the Advanced Illinois report. I did send a letter back to Robin Staines, and I know Robin, and we talked quite a bit. And I said, the only problem with this report is you don't disaggregate the report. And so you're using averages, but you're using averages in the city of Chicago that draw down a lot of the averages for the rest of the state. And so all the reform dialogue that we're having is typically outside of Chicago, and Chicago is having its own reform dialogue. And yet we get all sort of blasted with the same average across the whole. And so we need to be a little bit careful about how much we sum up everything and try to make an average on any of these items and have those be measurable items for us in terms of policy change. We have to disaggregate and find out where the problems are and face those problems. And that's.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.